Welcome, everyone. This is another installment in Aliant series on cross-border M&A transactions. And with me today I have Julia Helml. Julia is the head of Aliant's Austria practice and a very, very experienced corporate and M&A attorney. Julia is one of the best-known corporate M&A attorneys in Austria. She has a very interesting background. She got her LLM from Santa Clara University in California. So she represents a lot of Western clients, speaks perfect English. And Julia will share with us some interesting takes on doing M&A deals in Austria. So Julia, welcome. It's great to have you. So let's get started. What would you say are three or so most interesting cultural aspects to watch for in Austria from a cultural standpoint?
Well, the Austrian business culture is strongly influenced by the German correctness, but always with a twist of a typical Austrian solution. So the German correctness is characterized by order and precision, as well as a very direct and honest communication. This can sometimes be perceived as impolite in other cultures, but is considered efficient and clear in Germany and Austria. And while these characteristics should contribute positively to efficiency and reliability, they can be perceived as rigid and inflexible. And here comes the typical Austrian solution into play. So Austrian culture places also a great value on consensus and compromise. A typical Austrian solution often involves all parties giving in a little bit to find a solution that is acceptable to all. So Austrians often look for a very practical and workable solution. A typical Austrian solution can be unconventional and innovative, often characterized by a certain shrewdness and creativity. Second, punctuality is highly valued in Austria. People are expected to be on time for appointments and meetings, and this is seen as a sign of respect and reliability. And third, in Austria, academic titles are often used in everyday communication. The use of titles shows respect and politeness towards the person being addressed. In a formal and professional context, it is particularly important to use the appropriate titles.
Ah, very interesting. I've heard very similar ideas from one of our colleagues in Germany. So it's interesting how there is some shared culture there between Austria and Germany, and I think those are really good points. Good advice. Thank you. What would you say are some of the more peculiar, interesting legal issues in Austria, specifically with respect to M&A transactions? Maybe something that's different than what we would find in other countries.
Yeah, Austria's law is very strict in capital maintenance rules. The same also applies to Germany, but the capital maintenance rules are even stricter in Austria because it simply covers all assets. In a nutshell, all transactions between shareholders and the entity, as well as between affiliates, must always be at arm's length terms, or otherwise they are deemed to be null and void. Another issue would be transfer of assets, which constitute a business unit, is strictly regulated under Austrian law. So contracts pertaining to a business unit are transferred automatically to the purchaser unless the parties agree otherwise. Such an agreement requires then a detailed list of all contracts not being transferred. In addition, in case of such transfer, the contract partner must be notified and may also object within 3 months. Further, if the contract is transferred, the seller still remains liable for liabilities relating to such contracts together with the purchaser. And also, if employees which are pertaining to such business unit are automatically transferred, their working conditions and terms of employment must be maintained also after the transfer. And any transfer-related termination prior or following to the transfer of the business unit is always null and void. And third, we have the issue about stamp duties. So contracts regarding legal assignments that are signed by both parties in Austria or even brought to Austria only at a later stage trigger stamp duties in the amount of 0.8% of the value of the assignment. So this always has to be regarded.
Interesting. You seem to know your stuff. Very well summarized. Thank you, Julia. Are there any sort of interesting clauses we might find in Austrian sale and purchase agreements that, again, may not be present in other jurisdictions?
Well, a clause which will always be included in an Austrian SPA is, for example, a representation and warranty in relation to the ownership of the shares of an Austrian limited liability company. The reason being that although the shareholders are registered with the Austrian Commercial Register, such registration has only declaratory effect. Consequently, in a due diligence, it can never be ruled out that the shares of the company have been sold to someone else. So a title chain can always only be a strong indication, but never a proof of ownership. Second, nearly all business activities in Austria require a business license, and consequently, compliance with trade regulations is a very common representation and warranty in Austrian SPAs. Further, an anti-sandbagging clause is always subject to negotiations between the seller and the purchaser. However, they are frequently introduced into SPAs. And finally, the Austrian Civil Code sets forth the concept of lesior enormis, which is a reduction by over half of one party. And such reduction entitles the other party to nullify the agreement. Therefore, the application of this lesior enormis concept should always be excluded in the contract. Prerequisite for being able to do so is that for both parties, the agreement, M&A deal, must be part of their business activities.
Interesting. Okay, cool. Thank you. Let's say you're representing a foreign acquirer, acquiring a target in Austria. What are some typical issues you would be considering when you're representing a client like that?
First, to transfer shares of an Austrian limited liability company, the SPA must be drawn up in the form of an Austrian notarial deed, which includes that the Austrian notary reads through the entire agreement in front of the parties, and it must then be signed in front of the notary. The notary then actually saws together all pages of the document. Consequently, if the SPA shall be signed under POA, due to, for example, language requirements, the POA must also be signed notarized, which must be considered in advance. Second, if the target company owns a real estate located in Austria, real estate transfer tax may apply. However, the tax can be circumvented with the right structure of the deal. And finally, I want again point out the Austrian capital maintenance rules, because under these rules, for example, cash pooling, which is common in most international groups, is always problematic. It is not considered to be at arm's length if the entity borrows money without any security or is not usually in the business of lending money. The test, usually applied by the Austrian courts, asks whether the entity would have made such transaction with a third party not affiliated with the entity. And the answer to this test probably always be no.
Interesting. Seems like there are a lot of formalities to doing deals in Austria.
Yes, that's right.
Okay. Well, final question. Give us some non-legal hints to getting the deal done in Austria.
Personally, I'm convinced that organization and structure is crucial, and this is already starting by setting up a legal team that is the best fit for the transaction at hand. In addition, there must be a strong lead, one lawyer who brings all the threads together. And in the end, it's always a business decision, without room for personal sensitivities. So if the time comes and the lawyers cannot agree on the last open items in the agreement, it's always time to hand over to the commercial side to finalize the deal. But it is our job to provide them with a perfect issues list so that they exactly know what they can give the other side and what is simply not negotiable.
Well, I have to say you're very knowledgeable on corporate M&A. If I ever have clients who are doing deals in Austria, you're my go-to lawyer. Thank you, Julia, for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.